to my top 10 favorite movies of 2024, and let's get this started quickly before there's any more controversies related to the Best Picture nominees. But before I start, I do have a few honorable mentions that missed the cut, including Wild Robot, A Complete Unknown, The Brutalist, Heretic, Sing Sing, Monkey Man, Nosferatu, Thelma, Conclave, Love Lies Bleeding, and Dune Part 2. And there's some acclaimed movies from 2024 that I still haven't seen yet for whatever reason. Yep, I knew it. It took too long. Another article about Emilia Perez. So without further ado, here's my top 10 favorite movies of 2024. Number 10, Longlegs. I really like the 90s police procedural vibe this movie was going for. It's got a great look to it, the sound design was fantastic, which isn't usually something I highlight, and I also love the way that certain shots were framed. It really made you scour every inch of the background. I didn't find it scary personally, but the old couple I was sitting next to in the cinema were flinching and yelling, which genuinely enhanced the experience for me. And even though I didn't find it scary, I did find it interesting, largely due to Nicolas Cage's captivating Tiny Tim-esque performance. If you're familiar with my channel, you'll know that I'm a giant Nicolas Cage fan, and I couldn't get enough of him in this movie. He's used somewhat sparingly, but I would get excited every time he popped up on screen. I think the movie lost its way slightly at the end, but I still found it a really enjoyable experience that stuck with me, and I'm looking forward to rewatching it and analyzing it eventually on my channel. Number 9, Saturday Night. I'm not an SNL guy by any means. I've barely seen any episodes the whole way through, and right after I watched this movie, I actually watched the very first episode of SNL, but I found it borderline unwatchable to the point where I had to fast forward some bits out of cringe. Yet this movie, which dramatizes the lead up to the airing of that episode, completely captured my attention, and I found it really entertaining. I dug the real-time structure, the frantic pacing with the jazz score and the long takes. It really got me stressed out and yelling stuff at the TV like, Dan Aykroyd, stop doing bits and help look for John Belushi, the show's about to start. The performances were great for the most part, and some of the impersonations were uncanny. But I think what brought this movie over the edge for me is that it got me thinking, for better or for worse, Lorne Michaels and his crew put on a goddamn show that night. And even watching this fictionalized, highly exaggerated account of what happened, by the end it gave me this heartwarming feeling, like, you know what, they had an artistic vision and they got it done. And say what you like about SNL, but it's still going on 49 seasons later, so I thought this was a fitting celebration. Number 8, Anora. I really like how director Sean Baker's stories feature protagonists that veer away from those we usually see at the center of a movie. I think the majority of its filmography at this point involves some sort of warts and all portrayal of a sex worker, and his latest film, Anora, is no exception. This movie has some really dynamic characters in it, and the performances are all great. Especially Mikey Madison, who's able to ground this character that toes the line between unlikable and, alright, you got me, I'm rooting for her now. The film is structured very cleverly. The first act is this idealized, romanticized Cinderella story, but in Act 2, the cracks in their love story begin to show, and we see the gritty reality of how this kind of thing would really play out when money, power, and love is involved. Act 2 is also where the humor really kicks in, and there's a surprising amount of laugh-out-loud moments. And at times the movie feels Safdie Brothers-esque with the escalation of the stress level. But the epilogue, and in particular the last scene of the film, is what really brought the movie home for me and made it resonate emotionally. And it probably has the most powerful ending to a movie this year, in my opinion. Number 7, A Real Pain. The title of this movie alludes to different forms of grief and trauma, be it major historical suffering like the Holocaust, which the protagonist's ancestors went through, or less serious but still emotionally affecting pain like depression or feelings of ennui. But the title A Real Pain also describes Kieran Culkin's character, who's a real pain in the ass at times. But nonetheless, he's a great character. When the movie started, I figured I'd find myself relating more to Jesse Eisenberg's character. The awkward, neurotic guy, which isn't much of a stretch for Eisenberg, but he does do a great job in the role, and he also wrote and directed the film. But I saw a surprising amount of myself in Kieran Culkin's character. And even though he was extremely cringe at times, I found his character to be vulnerable and relatable. And you also don't usually see the relationship between two cousins explored much in a film. And I think their contrasting characters lent itself to a really compelling character study. Number 6, Challengers. So two things I don't give two shits about are love triangles and tennis. But despite being a love triangle about tennis, Challengers kind of transcended and elevated both of those things for me. I actually really liked the quirky, creative ways that the tennis scenes were shot, and the game of tennis itself was a nice metaphor for the back and forth power plays between the characters. And that central trio of characters is what made the movie so interesting to me. They're all quite flawed people with their own conflicting interests, but they were still fascinating characters, and they all had their own redeeming qualities in their own way. The movie probably has my favorite musical score of the year, and I also respect the fact that the movie managed to ooze sexuality despite having very little scenes of intimacy. But it found other ways to be sexually charged. Like, it definitely had the most erotic churro bite I've ever seen. Number 5, Flow. There were several animated movies that I enjoyed in 2024, but the one that impressed me the most was this Latvian indie film that managed to tell a gripping story about animals bonding together during a flood, and the whole movie is told with no dialogue. The animation is beautiful, every frame's a painting, as they say. I love the central cast of characters in the movie, and I like that even though they weren't anthropomorphized and they acted realistically like animals would, it was still easy for me to apply human characteristics to them. Like, you've got the cat that's like the everyman, and you've got the chill guy capybara and the hoarder lemur. It's quite the ragtag team, and I was very invested in their survival. And I think we could all learn a lesson from the overall theme of banding together in the face of adversity. Number 4, Hundreds of Beavers. As I've gotten older, I rarely seek out straight-up comedies anymore. I've just found that I need a little bit more than that in my movies. But this was a comedy that I really liked. It's very quirky, and the scrappy, low-budget style is inspiring. The comedy is very slapsticky and Wile E. Coyote-esque a lot of the time. The gags come at a rapid pace, and even when a joke wouldn't land for me, later there would usually be a callback to it and it would turn into something that I did find funny. Or else they would pay off the joke as a plot device to further the story. I also really like the video game structure the story begins to take after a while, where the protagonist had to use his skills to get enough money to get a new item, and then he could get more money and unlock a new thing. It felt very Legend of Zelda in that regard. I also think this movie is going to age quite well because there's no topical references that it hinges upon. It's just a bunch of old school vaudevillian gags involving beavers. It's a very fun time. Number 3, The Substance. I've seen a few reviewers preface their thoughts of The Substance with them saying, I almost didn't watch this movie because body horror isn't really my thing, but I'm completely opposite. As soon as I heard that there was a 2024 movie with shades of old school David Cronenberg films, as well as comparisons to Brian Yuzna's film Society, I was like, shut up and take my money. But what I loved about this movie is that it was able to blend the gross out body horror with relevant themes of Hollywood's expectations, beauty standards, and self-identity. Admittedly, these themes aren't portrayed in a particularly subtle way, but I think they're important messages nonetheless. And I liked that the movie kept finding new ways of making me feel uncomfortable. At a certain point I thought, okay, this movie has maxed out its weirdness. You know, it's hit the point of diminishing returns where I'm gonna be unfazed by the rest of the movie. But then right after it found a way to top even that and I was newly weirded out all over again. Number 2, A Different Man. Thematically, this is a somewhat similar story to The Substance. They're both stories about identity and society's reaction to outward appearances brought on by a secret metamorphosis. But while The Substance presented those themes through the lens of body horror, A Different Man is a much more low-key, almost Charlie Kaufman-style story, with layers upon layers of dramatic irony. It's the story of a guy with neurofibromatosis who goes through an experimental treatment to change his face, and he finds that his life changes too. But then he meets another guy with neurofibromatosis who's living a much happier existence than him, which brings up all sorts of themes of self-acceptance. And as an introvert, that's quite relatable to me. And it all ties back to the old adage of it's what's on the inside that counts. The film is almost a Tales from the Crypt style cautionary tale of irony, but the writing is really sharp with a clever underlying subtext, and the characters and performances are all great, so definitely check this one out if you like The Substance. I think they'd make a good double feature together. And number 1, Kneecap. As a half Englishman, this movie gave me a bit of that feeling I get when I'm at an Irish family gathering and they're all singing Irish rebel songs about how bad the British people are, and I'm just sitting there going, oh boy. But also, as a half Irishman, this movie made me feel proud. And not just because some of it was filmed on the street where my ancestors used to live, but because it's a celebration of Irish heritage that tells an important message about preserving culture and language. And it preaches that as long as you keep that going, you're keeping your history alive, which is something I can fully get behind. But the movie is also a blast. I'm not the biggest fan of musical biopics in general, but this one managed to avoid their typical structure and tropes. You can take a lot of the facts in this with a pinch of salt, but I think that added to the fun, and you don't often get a musical biopic with a ketamine-induced claymation sequence. I'm also now a fan of Kneecap's music. I quite enjoyed their latest album. And also, I went into this movie in a bit of a bad mood, and I came out of it grinning from ear to ear, which I think is a huge testament to the film's energy. So that's been my top 10 favorite movies of 2024, and until the next one, thanks for watching.